Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Ori Brafman, who is a multiple New York Times bestselling author. His seminal work, The Starfish and the Spider, is being used by the U.S. military. Its concepts have been implemented by Fortune 500 companies and the U.S. government and is considered the basis for blockchain technologies. Ori's recent best-selling book, Radical Inclusion: What the Post-911 World Should Have Taught Us About Leadership, which, by the way, is co-authored with General Martin Dempsey, examines today's leadership landscape and argues that inclusion is no longer a nice-to-have, but a strategic imperative in the digital world. Ori Brafman, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Well, thanks for having me, John.
Could we start with the starfish and the spider? For those unfamiliar with this seemingly unusual animal pairing analogy, could you describe why it's interesting and how it relates to today's competitive landscape?
Sure. So the metaphor of the book is you take a spider and you cut off the head. What happens? It dies, right? You cut off the arm of a starfish and it grows one back. That's because unlike the spider, the starfish doesn't have a central brain. Each one of the organs are replicated across the arms. You think about that as a metaphor for business and society, all the way from Alcoholics Anonymous to Wikipedia to, unfortunately, terror networks like Al-Qaeda. These starfish organizations are changing the rules of the game, and that unless we have the right strategy to counter them, we risk making the problem even bigger because we cut off the head and two new heads emerge, so to speak.
Right. That's a awesome way of thinking about today's problems. And so this was a 2006 was when you published this book. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So Facebook was perhaps just getting started around then, but the concept of networks in our public discourse was not where it is today. But networks play heavily in this concept. Does it? Do they not?
You know, it's one of the things we really missed. When you write a book, you wish sometimes that you'd be able to keep on rewriting it. So one of the big investors in Facebook wanted to introduce us as we were writing, and we were kind of wrapping up the book by then, and didn't include it. I was like, oh, yeah, that's an oversight. But you think about Facebook, and especially from a national security perspective, and you ask, is Facebook a national security? Is it a national security player? I would argue yes. Is it a national security asset, or is it a national security threat? And the reason I asked that is I've asked this in the Marines Commander's course. Let's talk about Nazis for a second, right? Let's jump into it. And John, let's talk about what we would do if we're fighting the Nazis in 1939. What do you do? You launch an attack. You coordinate it. There's an air attack. There's a whole sorts of stuff that we did in order to capture Berlin. What do we do about 2021? Real Nazis. I'm not talking about symbolic Nazis. I'm talking about swastika wearing, actual, no kidding Nazis. Mm-hmm. How do you combat them? How do you combat them when they've become more decentralized? And how do we operate in this more non-kinetic environment? I would further ask, with Facebook and with other social media, what has happened to the idea of objective truth? And when you have a starfish army, if you will, whether intentionally or unintentionally spreading misinformation. And without getting into politics, whatever your politics are today, domestically, if you see a post, chances are that you think that something is false information, regardless of where you are in the political aisle.
Yeah.
So we can all agree that there's false information out there. What happens when that false information has the effect of having us not know what the truth is? And specifically, when you launch an attack on any society, the way to launch an effective attack is by taking away trust in institutions. Is that happening in our country today? And we can argue whether that's intentional or non-intentional, but I don't think we can argue that it's happening. And how do we actually take that? And what do we actually do about this very specific problem?
Yeah. In your book, you have a number of principles which characterize leaderless organization. So I've got just like a little crib sheet, but like a couple of them are, so like when attacked, a decentralized organization tends to become even more open and decentralized. And to your example about present day extremist groups, Nazi groups, others, if attacked directly, then those types of, following along with your principles here, they would tend to become more distributed and harder to stamp out. You also mentioned that decentralized groups don't have central intelligence, that the intelligence or the values are distributed throughout the system. And in fact, they tend to be values driven more so than, I think, governance driven. Could you take that in a productive direction?
Sure. Well, first of all, I wish I had the script sheet when I wrote the book, John. It would have been really helpful, let me tell you.
I'm sure. I mean, you had to derive all this the hard way. I've got it the easy way. Yeah.
So let's address them in order. So the first one was when attacked, a decentralized or a starfish organization becomes even more starfish. The reason from that is not from a ideological perspective, but from a pragmatic perspective. So that if you are taking on, let's use overseas terrorism, if you're taking on an opponent as formidable as the United States, your only option is to be more decentralized and to be more starfish. That is your only option to survive. So people are doing this from a strategic and from an economic perspective. And when you take out a leader in whatever capacity you're able to, other people take their roles and they've learned something. And they've learned that, so there's a balance between centralized and decentralized, or starfish and spider. And in no way am I saying that starfish good, spider bad.
Yeah, there's a spectrum.
There's a spectrum. And organizations want to be somewhere in between. They only go to the extremes because of external factors that create those conditions. So if you're in a condition where you're fighting a more powerful opponent, you have to be starfish in order to either avoid detection or avoid arrest or avoid death. And we see that again and again and again. You see that in the Hong Kong protests that needed to become. I had 10 years ago, I had a very interesting, we convened the heads of the Tea Party or the founders of the Tea Party with the people who ran Occupy, talking not about politics, because we couldn't get them to agree on politics, but talking about how they both were using Starfish in order as a strategic tool in order to affect change however they saw it. And towards the second point, in terms of centralizing intelligence, these organizations oftentimes are values driven because, and let's see whether blockchain changes this or not, but oftentimes it's more difficult to extract profit from a pure Starfish play. Like no one's getting rich off of Wikipedia or no one's really getting rich off of Alcoholics Anonymous. Right. Yeah. So your uniting force is going to be shared values. Right. I believe that we're now in a place where the video or the meme is in itself an organizing actor, which is really weird to think about.
You're talking about like videos themselves, individual
videos themselves, videos themselves without, and I don't think there's necessarily intentionality there, but a video is created. The video needs to be seen from a biological perspective, and organisms want to do two things. Every organism, they want to eat and they want to reproduce.
Okay, all right, yeah.
Right. Okay. So how does a video, quote unquote, eat? It gets
viewership, maybe.
Viewership, right?
Okay.
And how does it reproduce?
Sharing via social media, or
right. Now, are you going to share a video that is Ori talking about the way that I brush my teeth, and probably not the most interesting thing,
or cat videos that are cute, or something
that are cute,
inflammatory.
Or if I say something not necessarily inflammatory is one of them, but something that is highly engaging, inflammatory content happens to be really engaging. That is going to then reproduce. And then that's going to get fed more because it draws a reaction. And that we need to have this lens, because I think that we are close to an environment where we literally are going to have a hard time telling what is actually the truth. And I'm not even talking about from a scientific analysis or something, but I'm talking about, so I live in San Francisco. Mm-hmm. Let's say that my social media feed says that across the bay in Berkeley, where I teach, there's a fire. Okay. And let's say there's a video for it. And is that video real or not? I will look to my friends and see what my friends say. And maybe for them, they see the fire and they respond to this. Now, if you have a different social media feed, there's a chance that you see a video where Berkeley's is fine and there's no fire whatsoever. This is not just a kind of something I dreamed up. A couple of years ago, there was, I believe it was Texas, there was on Twitter, they were saying that there was an explosion at a chemical company. Mm-hmm. Or there was a video about it. The fire department saw the video, rushed to the scene. Emergency responders rushed to the scene. Turned out there was no fire. It's debatable whether that video was just a scam or whether it was an actor trying to test out what happened. But imagine if you have this content and it's difficult to perceive which one is real and which one is not, how do we navigate in this world? And where this gets a little out there is I argue that we're simply not going to be able to tell. So we're going to have two options. One is I'm going to need to have eyes on the ground, which I trust. And I'm going to have to create a network of folks that I can trust, that I can verify. John, I know you're in Portland. Is Portland on fire right now? And I assume looking out the window, you'd say no.
Where I am, the answer is no.
Okay. So I now have verified eyes on the ground. I also need to verify that it's you, which is kind of interesting, right? This is actually John I'm talking to, and I have some level of trust with you, or a lot of trust with you, and okay, Portland's on fire. Or we're getting into a world where the narratives compete with one another, and the one that wins is the one that's going to be more interesting. And that we're no longer fighting a battle for right or wrong. We're fighting a battle for what's more interesting.
So to relate this to your earlier point about extremist groups and how extremist groups are difficult to counter and stamp out, to attack, you're saying take that concept, but into the truth versus falsehood, and falsehood in general being likened to extremist groups, and falsehood spreading, or trying to stamp out falsehood is as wicked of a problem as it is trying to stamp out extremist groups. Maybe.
Correct. So how is this going to change? One way of changing is saying, you, the content provider, Facebook, TikTok, Twitter, you're accountable. And if there's a falsehood that you're accountable. And while there can be a whole lot of arguments why that's so difficult, I would turn to what the Germans said to eBay back in the early days of eBay, which is a pretty decentralized network, where they told eBay, so eBay was, people were selling Nazi paraphernalia on eBay.
Mm-hmm.
And Germany was like, illegal. And eBay was like, yeah, this is a problem that's impossible to solve. Germany says, I don't know the exact details, but Germany essentially says that no, this is a crime, and a crime that you are personally, individually responsible for. And somehow they managed a way of not having this information. So, or sorry, not disinformation. They somehow managed to not sell Nazi paraphernalia in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
Very sensitive topic. We have the same level of strictness with inappropriate content with kids. Yeah. Right? We have a very strict, and you will not have this. And if you have the server, the force of the law will come down on you. We haven't yet decided to do that as a society. So one way is making the, and we have a little bit of a hot potato topic right now, where Facebook will say, well, it's not our content, someone else created the content. Okay, so who do I go after? Like, what if it's an anonymous contributor? Like, you can have content that is literally murderous. Literally people streaming murder on their live feeds, and people saying like, oh, it's not me. And I think that is one way of changing that by actually changing federal law. The second approach, and these are not mutually exclusive. The second approach is for us to see this as a national security threat, and to say there will always be extremist content. That content is interesting. The way to compete with it is two or threefold. First is we can compete with creating interesting content that is pro-liberty, pro-democracy.
Mm-hmm.
We can amplify that because you're now fighting a PageRank war. We can also fight it with noise. So you try to search X or Y content, and we'll give you a bunch of noise.
Oh.
And make them boring.
Oh, right. Yeah. Huh.
But now that we're putting on our lens on this about this is an actual security threat, there's ways of dealing with it. I think our challenge as a country is, again, there's a hot potato issue. Which of the national security apparatuses are going to be the ones responsible for this? And what if the content is created, and I'm talking from a US perspective, but what if the content is created in the United States by US citizens?
Right. Yeah.
Where does it live?
Yeah. We touched upon this in a previous episode. I suggest to listeners, go back and we'll have a link in the show notes to an episode we did with FBI agent or former FBI agent Clint Watts, where he talks about these trade-offs between freedom and security. And it's a very, also another episode with Mike Vickers where, you know, this is a real dilemma for us, and we need to have a frank and open conversation because it is impossible to be 100% free and secure, but we also don't want a lockdown security state where freedom is stifled. So there's some sort of an in-between, which is an excruciating trade-off that we are grappling with, and we need to continue grappling with. That's really interesting. So if someone goes onto a search engine and searches for some kind of content which somebody would have to identify as emotionally charged or illegal content maybe, but if someone searches for this kind of content, then they get, you know, thrown up a whole bunch of junk, and their search results get tarnished or in some way that stymies their access to that kind of content. So that's an interesting solution that is also fraught with all kinds of First Amendment issues, and presumably.
There's a whole lot of First Amendment issues, and there's a couple of topics that I think we need to really look at. First of all, is use of technology, or rather it's a question, how much this use of this technology is similar to use of substances, mind-altering substances, be it alcohol or be it illegal drugs. And the data is out there that a lot of this is addictive, and purposely so. And if you have someone, does it impair the user, just the addictive elements of it? Are we dealing with impaired users? And should we, in the same way that, look, I enjoy beer, but it's also highly regulated from the federal government as a substance that needs to be, and should we look at social media from that perspective? Along with that, and I'm in no way calling for a police state, but I'm saying, like, if people are reacting in ways that they almost look intoxicated, maybe we should think about it. Similarly, I think we really need to take into consideration how much trust we have in our institutions. And as we started, right, if there's an active, whether it's a coordinated or uncoordinated war against trust in our institutions, that is going to bring our society to its knees. And I'm seeing that around me, and that for me is, I think, the biggest issue that you have for our society, for obvious reasons, including economic reasons. The huge advantage that the United States has is the rule of law. If you and I make a contract,
yeah.
It can get, and we have a conflict, it can get resolved in a non-violent way with a system that enforces that. The moment that you either constantly poke holes at the system, and conversely, the moment that the system acts in ways that don't engender trust, we're a little bit in trouble. So when your health provider signs scripts for heroin, that's a problem.
Mm-hmm.
When your planes fall out of the sky, literally, that's a problem. When your company gambles your 401k and loses it, that's a problem. And we need to address that because those are the foundations of our absolute foundations of our society.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a good point about institutions. And I hate to keep referring listeners back, but another discussion that we had was a gentleman named Jonathan Rausch, who recently published a book called The Constitution of Knowledge, which is all about how institutions help mediate public discourse productively so that we can disagree relatively amicably. It's still messy. Democracy is messy. It's not like it's a clean process, but it's better than fighting it out with pitchforks and and revolution. And that relies on institutions to help mediate discourse and to produce knowledge that we all generally agree on. So 100% on all that, Ori. I'd like to transition a little bit, perhaps, to talk about your work with General Dempsey. How did you get connected up with him, and could you talk a little bit about that effort?
Sure. So, as background, I went to my undergrad. I did at UC Berkeley, where I was a peace and conflict studies major. And I started a vegan nonprofit when I was an undergrad. The last place I ever thought I would end up would be the inside of the Pentagon. So Dempsey reached out when he was in charge of TRADOC, the Army's Training and Doctrine Command, and had read my book and saw the parallels between fighting Starfish and fighting terror networks. He invited me over. Believe it or not, it was actually the first conversation I ever had with anyone in uniform. This
was what time period?
This is 2009, 2010.
Okay.
And he was a 4-star at the time. My first question to him was like, is there a 5-star? Apparently there aren't. And kind of didn't know what to call him, so called him Marty. And we sat in his office and he talked about how the Army was incorporating these strategies. And he kind of looks at me and says, what would you do? And my first reaction is, the truth is, I don't know. I think the Army has plenty of people from the outside telling it how it should change.
Lots of consultants, yes.
Lots of consultants. And what I said was, because of the stars in your uniform, you are too far removed from the edge of the network in order to have some of the best ideas. And it's not because of your personality. It's a fact that when you put on the stars, when you put on a uniform, it's against people's interests to always tell you the truth. And that rather than thinking about changing individual characteristics, we need to think about how do we create a network around us where different nodes are activated depending on the context of the situation to provide novel and informative knowledge that allows to, he has a concept of a lack of imagination, and how do we get over that? And we get over that by continually being surprised. So over these last 10 years, I've worked with different branches to create human networks within DoD. and also between DoD and other institutions to create a network that can then tackle the network opponents that we have. Some of the work has been just within DoD, some of it has also been so brought out folks here to Silicon Valley, brought active duty individuals to the UC Berkeley campus, 30 folks, and focused on building relationships with unlikely partners like UC Berkeley. And the idea here is we need to deal with the human component here, and that we oftentimes shortcut the human connection and go immediately into problem solving. And what I found is that my friends and fellow faculty at Berkeley, when you take politics aside, you have to put politics down. When we talk about values and shared values, we all have very similar shared values. And if you can focus on those, then you can actually make a difference.
Right.
I think that the relationships between DoD and Silicon Valley can continue to strengthen and can continue to focus on the human capital element, not just on, yes, there's good conversations to have about shared technology and strategy and all sorts of stuff, but I think that the human element is the one that is hard for us to conceptualize, and it's the one that we sometimes leave by the wayside, but I think it's the most important element. If I were to tell you, hey, you're going to a different country and you need to get them to work with you, what would you do? The first thing you would do is you would send a couple of folks to create friends, to create alliances, and we need to do the same thing between DC and San Francisco, Silicon Valley. And I think that the mil-civ divide is probably the biggest national security threat that we have.
That's interesting. So you've been dialoguing with the military like since 2009, I guess, since you and General Dempsey first got connected. Do you notice a difference in the tenor of the conversations, or in the, I don't know, perhaps the receptiveness of the people with whom you're talking, if you compare 2009 era military leaders to people you're talking about today? Is there a difference in the way those people are engaging with your ideas?
Yes, I would say that first of all, I've changed myself in a way that I'm very happy with, in terms of, I think I entered the situation with, frankly, a lot of fear and probably mistrust over the national security apparatus. I think that has changed, and I've seen the immense integrity of Marty Dempsey and many other folks who have just integrity down to their bone. I think from whether I've seen the conversation change, I think I have, in terms of, you have commanders who are saying, we're not going to be able to kill our way out of this battle. Lethality is no longer the way that we're going to be able to fix this. And I think that is a fundamental paradigm shift. I don't know whether it's a IO kind of a topic, or I don't think we've yet put our heads around how do we actually change our efforts. And I think cyber is doing wonderful things, but I think that as an entire force, we haven't yet put again, it's back to the Nazis. What are you going to do? How are you going to deal? How are you going to deal with them?
Yeah. Last thing I wanted to touch on with you here, Ori, is this has kind of been interwoven throughout our entire conversation. I just want to make it a little bit more explicit. But when people talk to you about resilience and anti-fragility, which are concepts that are floating around the ecosystem these days, how do you nest that into today's needs for our society, but also in the starfish and the spider concept as well.
It goes back to the human connection, and it goes back where the opportunity is. As our society continues to be incredibly splintered, trust in the armed services still remains high. And in fact, when you survey Americans about which institutions they trust the most, you'll get in the top 5, 10, Marines, Navy, Army, Air Force. How do we leverage the trust in this institution to bring us together as a country by focusing on shared values, so that resilience comes from the person to my left and the person to my right, with whom I have a strong human bond? How do we expand that? And this is where inclusion comes in, to connect on a human level and on values, on shared values, rather than a debate.
Yeah.
And I know that that is going to be, whether you're in battle or whether you're coming back from battle, or the connections that you have in your human network, those are going to be the ones that are going to keep you resilient.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Thought-provoking stuff. With that, Ori Brafman, thank you so much for being on the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you so much for having me, John.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.